balance, the current authorization for use of military force gives too much power to the president. Observation, looking to the AUMF's statutory construction or its specific wording, if it enables the president to take actions unrelated to the law, it gives him too much power. All other statements not in the law are therefore seen as conjecture and are non-resolutional. Contention 1 is presidential overreach, subpoint A is perpetual warning. Specific wording of the AUMF creates a system of unjust checks on behalf of the president. The Harvard Security Journal reports a declaration of armed conflict against a long and or open-ended list of emerging terrorist groups undermines the important distinctions between war and peace. The Witherspoon Institute furthers, the only limitation is that the president must make the determination, presumably in his own good faith, that the connection is both real and sufficient. But by the AUMF's own terms, it's the president's determination. Subpoint B is power snatch. The AUMF gives the president the ability to seize powers granted only under war without congressional approval. The Heritage Foundation reports authorizations in declared wars do not restrict the resources available to the president, do not limit the methods of force the president can use, do not place express limits on authorized targets other than by naming an enemy, and do not place the purpose of defeating the enemy and bringing the war to a successful conclusion. Using their 5 analytical components for evaluating AUMFs, Bradley and Goldsmith conclude that the AUMF is as broad as authorizations in declared wars with respect to the resources and methods it allows the president to employ. The Atlantic finds, nevertheless, the AUMF goes much too far in permitting the president to escalate the war on terror to new heights without the consent of Congress and the American people. The New York Times reports the administration has decided it needs no new legal authority from Congress to indefinitely keep American forces in Syria and Iraq. We derive 2 main impacts from this. Impact 1, worded in such a way that gives the president the authority to dictate targets in the name of so-called national security, the continued state of warring that has undermined the clear line between war and peacetime draws the U.S. into an endless conflict. Impact 2, presidential overstep through the AUMF has enabled the president to take powers only allocated in times of war. This undermines the set system of checks and balances during times of peace and expands conflict to unexpected regions. Contention 2 is increased instability. Subpoint A is regional volatility. Through the AUMF, the American military has been unjustly deployed throughout the world, leaving volatile regions even more unstable. According to U.S. News, the Brown University Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs, the U.S. is waging its war on terror in 76 countries, or more simply put, 40% of the countries on this planet. The president's continually increasing interventionism within Africa through the AUMF increases tensions. From Forbes, the region is aflame and U.S. policy bears much of the blame. Washington's relentless attempts to reorder and reshape complex peoples, distant places, and volatile disputes has backfired spectacularly. America has caused manifold problems whilst proving unable to solve any of them. Subpoint B is increasing terrorism. Due to the increased rate of U.S. interventionism, the president has spawned more support for terrorist organizations. According to Foreign Policy, as the U.S. has occupied Afghanistan and Iraq, which have a combined population of around 60 million, total suicide attacks worldwide have risen dramatically, from about 300 from 1980 to 2003 to 1,800 from 2004 to 2009. 90% were due to anti-American sentiment. The Army War College reports increased U.S. efforts are correlated with a worsening of the overall terror situation. Statistical modeling indicates that for every additional $1 billion spent and 1,000 American troops sent to the war on terror, the number of terror attacks worldwide increases by around 19. Al Jazeera finds further, but the large scale and still expanding militarization and securitization of U.S. policy exacerbates economic conflicts and inequalities, and thus strengthens the position of the groups that are violently reacting to the process. We derive 2 impacts from this as well. Impact 1, unchecked and increased interventionism by the president on the view he takes that supposed democracy and freedom for the Middle East causes unstable regions to become even more volatile through faulty U.S. policy measures. Impact 2, ideological groups taking militarism as a guise for foreign invasion and occupation increases both attacks and recruitment, fueling instability and anti-U.S. rhetoric, and for these reasons, you're going to only affirm.
Sorry, that was the wrong case. Oh, not once in this tournament. All right.
So what about Abraham?
Sorry. Okay, all right. Are my opponents ready? Matt, are you ready?
Ready.
Are all my judges ready?
Are you ready?
All right, that's up to us. We'll see. All right, then let's begin. Wesley Smith, the senior military analyst at the American Center for Law and Justice explains, in a rapidly changing and dangerous world where the threats to our nation and to civilization are more insidious and lethal than any time in history, the role of the commander-in-chief has become central to the duties and responsibilities as president. Because of this, Matt and I negate the following resolution. Resolved. On balance, the current authorization for the use of military force gives too much power to the president. Contention 1, the AUMF uniquely enables quick response to terrorism. Without the AUMF, the president must rely on Congress as the decision-making body to authorize any sort of military action under Article 1 of the Constitution. Wesley Smith continues on why this is an issue. He explains, "It is impossible to imagine how long it would take to get Congress to agree on the conditions for a declaration for every single military operation. More likely, the fighting would be over before we could act, and our homeland or strategic interest would be in grave danger as a result." The AUMF is an effective pathway to combating the terror threat globally. Matthew Weed, a specialist in foreign policy legislation for the Congressional Research Service, finds that the 2001 AUMF provides authority to meet all U.S. military requirements to respond effectively and flexibly to terrorist threats globally. The impact of this is that terrorist groups are undercut by the AUMF. As of August 2017, the United States has removed ISIS from 87% of the territory they once held and liberated over 6.5 million people. The special presidential envoy for the Global Coalition to Counter ISIS, Brett McGurk, explains that these people are Iraqis and Syrians who are living under ISIS, and that most importantly, the migrant refugee flow that we used to see has now reversed. Contention 2, the AUMF relies on a system of checks and balances. The system of checks and balances remains intact, keeping the presidential power in balance and preventing the office from having too much power. This is done in 3 distinct ways. First, congressional oversight. Despite having held the ability for 17 years, Congress has never chosen to repeal or amend the AUMF. The Council on Foreign Relations details that Congress has the power to authorize hostilities at any level and to fund them. Thus, the passage of the AUMF and its subsequent acceptance is simply Congress fulfilling this power and not any sort of presidential dominance. Second, congressional funding. The U.S. Constitution designates the power of the purse as a function of Congress. As the National Priorities Project explains, Congress creates a new budget for a country every year. This means that Congress determines the extent of the country's military funding, meaning that they could strengthen or weaken the president's power abroad. An example of this is in Somalia. Louis Fisher, the previous senior specialist in the separation of powers for the CRS, explains, "What began as a humanitarian mission turned into the use of military force against a Somali political figure. Congress turned to the spending power to end military involvement. Legislation provided that no funds could be used for expenses, which stopped our conflict there." Third, through international checks. International actors work as a check for presidential power. If he steps out of bounds, there is foreign backlash. Ashley Deeks, the senior fellow at the Center for International Law, explains in a UChicago Law Review, "Foreign states that wish to continue to cooperate with the U.S. intelligence apparatus pay keen attention to how the U.S. executive conducts its national security policies. Foreign actors have demonstrated their abilities to diminish the executive's national security dominance by either stimulating the functions of U.S. checks and balances or directly limiting the executive's freedom of operation. In a world where spying becomes increasingly publicized, contentious, and regulated, foreign actors undoubtedly will continue to check the U.S. executive in subtle but powerful ways. To provide one of many empirical examples, when the U.S. created black sites and detention facilities on foreign soil, the states that initially permitted us to be there withdrew their consent as they became increasingly uncomfortable with how unfettered the U.S. executive was. As a result, the CIA has terminated its secret detention and interrogation programs, which directly shows this international check working. These 3 methods of checking the power of the AUMF ensure that its powers are not excessive and allows it to be used efficiently and effectively. And for these reasons, Matt and I strongly urge a ballot in negation.
We're talking about ISIS.
Yeah.
How do they plan, commit, or aid the terrorist attacks of 9/11? Because isn't that what the AUMF says?
Okay, so what we're going to look at here is the fact that ISIS was initially a part of Al-Qaeda. That is where they were the associated forces, and that's why it's justified under the AUMF.
And when did they break off? 2004, right?
I believe it was later.
Okay, so then how are they even associated? Because they're not considered an associated force. They weren't a separate entity at the time, and like post 9/11.
Okay, well, the fact of the matter is that what we started there was our intervention against ISIS, right? Our battle against terrorism with ISIS is what's become the prevalent threat right now. What it says in the AUMF is that we are there to protect against future implications against our country.
So shouldn't we adopt new legislation to then fit the role of ISIS and the role on terror?
No, not necessarily, because most people agree that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are linked. You have a question?
But actually, does the legal authority deem that ISIS and Al-Qaeda are linked?
Yeah, it does. If you read what the AUMF says, it actually says that it's associated forces, anyone who's harbored, or they're linked to this, all right?
No, so I don't think it says associated forces at all. It says planned, committed, or aided.
Okay, so then what is an associated force if you're going to say that?
So the associated force is actually a definition deemed from the president. When the president says we're going to strike this group, it's on his own definition and it's on his own authority. There is nothing in the AUMF that says associated forces, and it doesn't even.
Okay, but even then, the limitation that's set by the AUMF clearly shows that there's restrictions on this. Why are you disregarding that?
I'm not regarding the restrictions. I'm just saying the restrictions don't work. Do you have a question?
Yeah, sure. Okay. In your second contention, you're talking about this power snatch. You say that it enabled us different powers of war. What powers are these?
Okay, so like we said in case, it's like the different methods the president can use and the resources available and where the president
Yeah,
can
so
go.
specifically, what are these?
Okay, so the resources, those are drone attacks against against foreign civilians. The troops, like those are the resources. And the where is anywhere the president deems fit in the Middle East.
So are these powers of war that you're talking about anything that's justified under like the Constitution, or like where are you getting these powers from?
I'm saying the Constitution has been checked by war powers, and the AMF delineates and like gives the president free reign over the powers. The AMF doesn't allow the president to do this.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
How is it checked by the war powers?
Okay, so it's checked by war powers because it says nothing in the AMF supersedes war powers, but the president has gone past the war
And that
powers
is the
pact.
key issue that you're
Because
going to have
actually,
here.
so can I?
Yeah, sure, you can go ahead.
So like Congress is supposed to be the one that approves foreign wars. So what's happening right now is the president, he's taken the powers that Congress should be giving him.
Yeah, I
and
know
he's
where you're going
run
with this. What you're ignoring here is that it doesn't say that it supersedes the entire war powers resolution. It only says one section of it. The power it does not supersede, however, is the part where it says that we don't have to follow this 60-day restriction that you're talking about. That's like, well,
Alright.
here. Like that's the main point.
And so has Congress ever, when you're talking about checks, has Congress ever cut the funding to the military budget? When?
Somalia.
In Somalia?
Yeah.
And
Vietnam.
Okay, so Vietnam, wasn't that actually after a ceasefire had happened and we brought the conflict to an end?
Well, what we can see is that the congressional funding here is what stopped our conflict and our intervention.
So
Even
when
if you don't buy that, though, I mean, look at Somalia.
So
So we
when-
have the direct link that says that.
So when
we
you're
stopped the
talking about
funding.
futurity and future response, are you saying that terrorism is just going to still increase over time and we're just going to keep
We're not saying it's
responding?
going to increase, but for us to say that it's going to be gone completely ever is completely irrational.
Sounds good.
Including my opponent's case and time loss, I'll read from my own. James, are you ready?
Yep.
Piyush, Matt, are you ready?
Yep.
Judges, are you ready? Then, let's begin. Now, starting with the observation, we are looking at the statutory construction of the AUMF, the actual wording that says terrorist organization had to plan, perpetrate, and commit the wars on 9/11. Nowhere in my opponent's case have they claimed that these facts and further in classifier they could not be able to answer. Hold them accountable to this standard because that is the wording of the AUMF. Going on to the contention one, a quick response. Classes directly with my contention one, subpoint A of perpetual warring, and my impacts from my contention two of regional instability. My opponents claim that there needs to be a quick response, but that is exactly the problem. Because the president wants a quick response, he does everything without authorization. Look to our contention one, we talk about perpetual warring. We say, according to Harvard, we do not know what the distinction between war and peace is anymore because the president is the sole authority. They talk about how there's transparency, but there is not transparency in the system. They claim that, don't let my opponents claim that congressional complacency equals a check. This is simply not true. All they argue is Congress is slow, so we should allow the president to have this power. That's inherently wrong. That is the same justification the president used to make these illegal wars. We are in a perpetual war. According to the Witherspoon Institute, he designates the targets. He designates their connection to 9/11. He designates the resources he can use. He does everything without congressional oversight, and that oversteps the war powers. That oversteps the war limits. For 17 years, we have used the same AUMF against us. And then they talk about ISIS. First, ISIS was not around when the terror attacks happened. So this is non-resolutional. Then they call co-belligerency. Co-belligerency is not in the AUMF. It's all groups that perpetrate, attack, and plan 9/11, and that is the connection we must hold my opponents to. This quick response has destabilized regions. Look to our contention 2 subpoint B, where we show you terrorism increase. According to the Army War College, the countries the United States has invaded have 136 more terror attacks on average. This inherently is wrong, and this is why the AUMF gives the president too much power. Going on to the contention 2 of checks and balances, classes directly with our contention 1. 1, their entire case is a contradiction. And their contention 1, they talk about how there's congressional gridlock, and then in the contention 2, they talk about efficient checks. These cannot coexist. You cannot have gridlock on one hand and checks on the other hand. So their entire case falls just on this simple point. In 17 years, they give no specific example where Congress authorized. They talk about Somalia. We are currently fighting Al-Shabaab Somalia to this day, which is not under 9/11. We talk about Boko Haram in Nigeria, Somalia, and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. We talk about Yemen, Syria, Libya. All these countries are unrelated. There are no checks with the president. Then we go to the Heritage Foundation card, which states, under the current 2001 AUMF, the president inherently has too much power. They did an analysis. He has the same power as if there was a declared war. The problem is there is no check on the president. There's no transparency in the status quo. They talk about this international check, but international checks are weak. There has never been a check by the United States on the international community. If you want a simple example, think about Russia and Ukraine. They try to sanction Russia, but Russia keeps its militarism. These international checks are vague and weak at best, and the president is actually breaking international law. He is breaking the Geneva Convention because he's going against people who did not attack U.S. soil. He is killing civilians in innocent countries, and that's what is wrong. The Atlantic states, the 100,000 Iraqi citizens who perished, the 4,500 American soldiers, and the $1 trillion spent in the war in Iraq was a waste because we just destabilized the region further. Their entire case is a contradiction and holeless. Again, I will repeat, there cannot be checks if they're arguing this congressional gridlock. What we're showing you in the status quo, because the AUMF gives President the sole authority to pick the targets, because my opponents fail to recognize that the associated forces are not linked under 2000 AUMF under statutory construction, and as we show you, terrorism has increased tenfold. We further, according to foreign policy, in Iraq and Afghanistan, countries we have been in for 17 years, suicide bombings increased by 6 times. This inherently shows you the abuse of the AUMF. As civilian casualties increase, as terrorism increase, as we erode checks and balances, inherently this is too much power, and that's why you must affirm.
Oh.
Why? Going over my opponent's case and attacking it, and if time allows, extending some of my own points. Judges 9, you guys ready? Yep. You ready? Judges all ready? All right, let's begin. Let's start right off the top with my opponent's framework, essentially saying how that if they prove that the AUMF is not the same as its original intent, then they must vote pro. Recognize that they're framing this as an original intent. That's not how laws work. They're constantly evolving in the status quo in the modern day. This is why we have an entire branch of the government dedicated to interpreting laws. Ayyan conveniently leaves out a few words from the AUMF in his rebuttal. It also says that the AUMF applies to groups that harbored or aided in the 9/11 terror attacks. Seeing as ISIS right there was a part of Al-Qaeda in 2001 when 9/11 happened, that right there is a link between the two. The original intent was a response to fight terrorism. Since we're showing you that the AUMF is the best way to fight terrorism, that's how we're winning under their framework anyway. With that, let's go on to my opponent's first contention, where they talk about how this is a constitutional violation and Congress doesn't have a check. Cross-apply this first of all to my second contention. Congressional inaction expresses tacit support for the AUMF. Benjamin Witt, is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute, reports that Congress is not complaining about the legality of what the president is doing. Congress, in fact, seems to want the president to do more, and they decline to pass a specific authorization to cover what he's doing or circumscribe the statute under which he claims to be operating. So right now we're seeing that whenever the president takes action, Congress is approving it by not taking any action against that. But then they talk about how ISIS is not a part of the AUMF. First of all, recognize that they were with Al-Qaeda in 9/11 when the terror attacks occurred. But then secondly, the U.S. itself claims that ISIS is a part of the AUMF, and legally this falls under the jurisdiction of the 2001 AUMF. The white paper on military operations writes that a determination has been made at the most senior levels of the U.S. government that ISIS is covered by the 2001 AUMF after a careful and lengthy evaluation of the intelligence concerning each group's organization, links with Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and participation in the ongoing hostilities against the United States and its coalition partners. But then they talk about this idea of never-ending war. Recognize that the nature of this terrorist threat is one of easy split durability and realignment. We are in a never-ending war because the enemy itself is inherently never-ending. My opponents are stuck in the frame of mind that this is just like a conventional war, that there's a centralized enemy. What we're seeing here is that there's no centralized enemy, and this isn't a war that we can just combat like a regular one. This has nothing to do with American involvement, but the fact that we're seeing the splintering happening means that we're in an indefinite war anyway. As Adam Klein of the Columbia Law Review details, the principal agent assumption underlying the law of war hostilities breaks down with respect to Al-Qaeda. Because of the possibility of the group splintering, the end of a group does not ever signal the end of terrorism. The threat emanating from an international jihadi who is part of a global struggle and may move from conflict to conflict as the theater of battle and the belligerent parties shift, or from a violent, radicalized individual not affiliated with any group derives this. So what we're seeing is that essentially, whenever the United States takes any action and we're seeing the splintering happening, the flexibility in the AUF is required because these groups can move from country to country. They can change names whenever they want to. This isn't some organized group that the United States is combating. When they're saying that they can't attack any terror group simply because they changed name or location, they're completely misrepresenting the actual state of the conflict. But then they talk about drone strikes. Recognize that even if you grant them the full force of the blowback argument, U.S. drone strikes have been successful in structurally weakening terror organizations in the long term. This occurs for 2 reasons. Daniel Byman of Brookings reports that U.S. drones kill top figures who are not easily replaced. And then when these experienced leaders are eliminated, the result is the rise of lower leaders who are prone to errors and miscalculations. As a result of these structural weakenings of terrorist groups, even if blowback creates more groups, these groups are significantly weaker because of that. This is why we see a global decrease in terrorist lethality. You can weigh this trend over anything else in the debate about the counterterrorism efficacy. The nonprofit Global Terrorism Index reports in 2017 that the intensity of global terrorism has decreased, even as it continues to spread to an increasing number of countries. So we're seeing is that yes, these terror groups are increasing to more countries, but what we're seeing is that because of U.S. intervention and because of drone strikes, they're becoming weaker, their attacks are becoming less. Now we also provide you with a 22% there's a 22% decrease in the amount of terror deaths worldwide. Recognize that this is the most recent piece of evidence. They cite Gopner, who again cannot prove to you any causality and is from 3 years ago. Recognize that we're showing you the most recent impact of today's round. We can prove to you that on net terrorism has decreased as a result of the AUMF, and for these reasons, Piyush and I strongly urge a ballot negation. Thank you.
Decreasing because you stated in your own case that we're spreading it to more countries.
Both.
They cannot
That's the
be
problem.
mutually exclusive.
Yes,
so
they
you're
can.
saying we're putting more people under oppressive terrorist regimes?
No.
That's
I'm
exactly
saying
what you
the
said
terrorist groups geographically are widening, right? That's what we agree on. But the problem is that because when they're widening, our drone strikes have taken out their top leaders. When their top leaders are
Actually,
taken out,
when we take out top leaders in that exact case, you said it says we weaken them and put more radical leaders in place. Then you look to my case,
we
we
put less effective leaders in place. That's the
no,
biggest difference.
in that card we'll bring it up according to the BBC. When drone strikes go in, we put more radical leaders leading to more.
Right. So do you have any evidence of the terrorism actually increasing?
Yes, look to our entire contention 1, contention 2, subpoint B of increasing terrorism.
With Gopner?
Well, we provide you a
Right.
foreign policy. No, that was one card. We also tell you a
Right.
foreign policy statistic where suicide bombings increased by 6
Suicide
times.
bombings. What about overall terror?
We have overall terror in that
With
card.
Gopner, right?
Yeah,
And Gopner's from 3 years ago, and our
it's from
evidence is from
2016
2017.
actually.
I know it was published in 2016. I'm very familiar with this card, as my team knows. The evidence was all from 2013 and 2014.
Whatever, it shows a trend from 2001 to 2000. Whatever, it shows a trend on net. The terrorism was increasing.
All right. Do you mind if I ask a question?
Go ahead.
All right. So when you're talking back to the AUMF, are you aware of the Associated Forces clause in here?
There is no associated forces.
Can you read this
clause
for
in
me?
the
The highlighted part.
All of it.
Yeah.
That the president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred in 9/11. This is just the
Committed or
AUMF.
aided, right? Yeah.
Yes.
So because
Can I ask
they
you a
aided,
question
because
on
they're
that point?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. How did Al-Shabaab, Boko Haram commit or aid the 9/11
Because they
attacks?
were all part of Al Qaeda and this general
No,
terrorist
this is
theme,
false.
right?
They were not a part of Al Qaeda. You can say they
Yeah.
pledged allegiance later, but that is not the
Yeah.
same as being
Al
a part of
Qaeda. Al
it.
Qaeda is like a vase, right? And it shattered after 2001 when they started to splinter into different groups.
No,
the United
this
States
is
is simply
a-
trying to pick up these pieces.
No, that's not what happened. You're using a false analogy. Boko Haram was already a group in Nigeria, and Al-Shabaab was a separate group.
But they worked with Al Qaeda.
That is
and all
not
this.
enough. That is not a link.
Yeah,
with
I can
AUMF
provide you with the evidence with the U.S. white paper saying that this is completely justified.
by
Do
the
you have a
United
question?
States.
Yeah.
Okay, that was my point. How are they related?
How are they related?
How did they plan, authorize, or commit 9/11?
How did they plan? I mean, I'm not one of these terror groups. I can't tell you exactly how they
So
all
exactly,
planned it
there's
together.
no reason we should be attacking them.
That's not what I'm saying.
That's what you're
right?
saying then.
No, because what happened was they planned these together, right? And
No,
the
they
United
did
States
not
has
plan the
reviewed.
9/11 attacks. That was committed by Al Qaeda, and then you could say Taliban have
Okay.
those.
So you're saying the one group, right? So just because they changed names, does that mean we're not allowed to attack them
No,
anymore?
that's actually a false analogy. Terrorist group just to go in.
I'm sorry. What are you talking about? You
They're-
didn't answer my question. So if they change their names, all of a sudden we can't attack them?
That's okay. That's a false analogy. They don't
That's-
just go
again,
and
you're not
change-
answering my
change
question.
their names. No, we cannot attack them under 2001 AUMF because that's. a-
So just so they change their names, right? So if I change my last name and me and Piyush become a different team, does that mean you can't attack our case?
That's not irrelevant to the resolution. They don't just go and change their name. Terrorist organization Boko Haram has a different
That's what's happened is
ideology
they
than-
splintered off into these different groups. We provide you evidence of that.
So
That's
it's
fine.
spreading to.
Look to our observation, uphold the definition and wording of the AMF that says planned, committed, aided, or harbored such people. So unless they can provide a link, all the cards that they're saying about decreasing terrorism is based off an illegal war. Fold this into my two main voting issues. Number one of overreach, two of instability. First of overreach, target, let's look to my first contention, target specifically the Heritage Foundation where it says the president is taking the power that he has during war. The methods he's using are drones. The resources he's using are American troops which are killing civilians. The where is anywhere the president deems fit in the Middle East. The presidential policy they see and they try to bring it up is associated forces. That's the president's definition. Meaning when the president intervenes, he's justifying it himself. He's saying, I'm doing this sounds good because I'm all about me and I'm very US centric. So this also draws us into endless conflict. Which one, as we look at our case, undermines war and peace. Two, it doesn't allow for the checks they talk about where we could decrease funding. Because the instances they brought up when they decrease funding is actually after the conflict ended. This is drawing us into endless conflict. And not only that, their whole case is a contradiction of itself. They can't say checks and balances work, but they can't also say that there's congressional gridlock. They need to make an advocacy here. And not only that, Congress didn't repeal the AUMF because they agreed with it. Congress thought the AUMF actually gave the president too broad a scope of power to deal with, and they're actually trying to repeal it. They just want a new one on the table before. So this will flow into my second main voting issue of instability. Classify my second contention, and let's look to the fact that responding to the outside factors of this group, they have to prove the links that they either planned or harbored, committed or aided the terrorist attacks. So let's link this specifically to Boko Haram, where we're destabilizing Africa. As a response here, this is a different title. And not only this, they talk about Al-Shabaab, Daesh, and ISIL, but the problem is ISIL wasn't even around, so they can't be considered an associated force under the president's own definition. Not only this, our response has actually increased there. They talk about how we're killing leaders and how we're decreasing and disorganizing terrorism, but the card they brought up, in the next line, it actually explicitly states that they become more and more radical. And this flows into the fact that the U.S. is responding and killing civilians. Cite the card in our case where we're seeing that we've killed 1,500 more civilians in that period that the U.S. has specifically intervened in these illegal wars, and thus you're only going to affirm.
Are judges ready? And let's begin. So let's look at the observation. They're talking about the actual wording. Remember that they're conveniently disputing the words about how it's harbored, like if we harbor these organizations, then we can attack them. Regardless, laws are constantly evolving, and that's why the AUMF is necessary. That's why you have the legislative who's making these changes. And then they also are he also conceded that ISIS was with Al-Qaeda in 2001, so that flows to our side. Our first voting issue is that how the AUMF uniquely allows us to combat the terrorist threat globally. Smith and Weed showed how Congress isn't fit to act, and how the AUMF gives us the flexibility necessary to fight terrorism globally. We see how ISIS has lost 87% of its land, and how 6.5 million people have been liberated, which they don't address. My opponents attack this by saying that quick response is enabling things without authorization. Like, what we're talking about here is how that we need this flexibility. Remember what my partner said about the name change. If if we didn't have any flexibility here, they could just change their name and then we couldn't attack them. They also say how congressional complacency isn't a check, and this is our justification for illegal wars. The president, Congress has ceded the power to the president to do these. This doesn't mean it's abuse. They've designated him as the best actor, and all of his actions are checked by our second contention. Then they also talk about co-belligerency. Look at what the AUMF says. So we're winning on magnitude because we're showing how the AUMF has allowed us to effectively combat terrorism, and weigh this over their perpetual war contention, because we show you through the white papers that ISIS is justified to attack, and second, that we're having a long-term impact of decreasing terrorism. We see the 22% decrease in global terror, and the fact that high-level operatives are being killed. And this is destabilizing these terrorist groups. Our second voting issue is checks and balances. What we show is three ways. First, Congress has the ability to repeal the AUMF. Second, Congress can defund our military actions. And third, international actors check our power. My opponents attack this by saying we have a contradiction. We're not talking about how Congress is gridlocked here. We're just saying that they have the power to repeal the AUMF in any situation. Second, they say the power of purse hasn't worked. Look to Somalia again. What we did was to initially get ourselves out of there. That's where we use the power of the purse. And third, they're talking about international checks, which are vague and weak. We're not talking about the U.S. checking others. It's others checking us. They don't understand this part, so weigh it in the round. We went on scope because we're showing you three fail-proof ways that the AUMF is checked. Weigh this over their constitutional violation, because we're not talking about legality here.
Face under international law besides get out of my country.
This isn't international law that we're talking about here. What we're talking about is how other countries are going to retaliate in the response to the president abusing his powers.
Have they, which countries have retaliated?
Well,
Yeah,
we're
we'll show you that in our second contention.
Okay, so here's the example that we're providing. There's been a bunch of them, but here's the one we're
You're
talking
naming
about.
one of them?
Yeah, so when we established black sites, which are like these detention facilities all around the world, what happened is these states that were initially hosting it, say for example Poland, they were feeling uncomfortable with how powerful the executive was. So what they did was they retaliated against us by taking away support, and through this, the UCIA was forced to shut down these detention facilities.
Have they ever done this for military intervention or the U.S. military being somewhere they shouldn't be?
That's right now we're showing you. That's what the military intervention oversees. The black sites are overseas in detention facilities operated by the U.S. military.
So isn't this, you said the CIA though, so isn't the CIA a separate entity?
Well, our detention here is justified under the AUMF. That's what we're talking
But
about.
that's not the same as CIA doing other operations. The CIA
It's not about that. These are just established black sites.
We're talking about the AUMF in this resolution.
Okay, and the CIA was able to stop this from happening when it was initially justified under the
You guys have a
president.
question? Yeah, so you mentioned in summary that ISIS wasn't around in 2001, right?
Right.
So where'd they come from?
Right, so they're not considered an associated force even under the
That's not what I asked. Where'd they come from?
They
Right,
came from
so-
U.S. intervention into Iraq, which destabilized the region, causing a power vacuum.
And where'd they come from? What
They-
group splintered down into
Okay,
them?
so I know what you're going to get into. You're going to say that they fractured from Al-Qaeda, but the fact of the matter is, when we're talking about it, when the law was passed, ISIS wasn't even a thing. They can't
Right, because
define
they
it as
were part of
associated
Al-Qaeda.
force because in the context of
No,
the
not
law,
anymore. They're actually warring with Al-Qaeda right now.
Yeah, okay, but they
In
were initially a
2001.
part of it. That's the whole reason why the AUMF is used to justify our action
Okay,
against
even
them.
if we agree to ISIS, why are you fighting Al-Shabaab? Why are you fighting Boko Haram? Where did they harbor and link?
Similarly, right? Your only link here is ISIS. You're only saying that ISIS,
No, I'm
the only
asking
evidence
you,
you provide
I asked you
here.
about Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, how they committed 9/11. That's under the AUMF, or even harbored, as you stated. Where
Because right now our biggest thing that we're fighting is ISIS right now.
No,
and that's the main
actually,
thing that you
we're still
attack.
fighting-
Even if we're going to concede that there's these other groups, what we can see is that this is about that splintering effect. These guys have all spread off, and that's why we need flexibility to address these
Okay,
threats
so
accurately.
exactly, U.S. intervention causing splintering of terrorism. And then you say terrorism is decreased.
Yes.
So which one is it? Terrorism decreasing or us spreading terrorism throughout the
Again,
world?
it's both.
Okay, so let's
increasing
clarify.
So we're putting
geographically,
more
and
people
deaths have
under
decreased.
oppressive terrorist regimes?
No. Okay,
Yes,
so
they
what we're
are.
talking
That's
about in
exactly what's
terrorism here
happening
is
in
how
Sandburg.
global terrorism has gone down by 22%. Sure, the geographical areas that we're covering has expanded, but this does not mean that the impacts of terrorism are any greater.
And when they splinter,
Yes,
the
they
US,
are, 'cause
US
they're going after
drone.
more people and causing more harm as we show you.
Wait, we're
With
showing
the-
like there's 22% less deaths.
there's
How is that
more
more people
politics
being
every
affected?
time we spend $1 billion.
That's not
we
answering
have
the
to
Piyush's
unite.
question.
It's not only that, on that note, so when laws are evolving to respond to those new fractured off terrorist groups, shouldn't they actually amend the AUMF then to fit it under legal?
No, because the AUF is flexible enough to cover for this.
And
If
that's
we're
why it was
supposed to
made like
amend
this.
if we're supposed to amend it to
So
add
then
restrictions.
justify all the terrorist groups Ayyan named under a plan, committed, aided, or harbored.
Okay, and then when they splinter off, what's going to justify the new terror groups? And
That's
that's
the
time.
problem. Let's begin. My opponent's entire case is the same justification the president uses to make these illegal wars. Don't let them weigh off that. Look to our observation in which we tell you of statutory construction. The words are perpetrated, harbored, and committed 9/11, and they have not been able to answer once in crossfire how these organizations are related. This brings me to my two main voting issues. Number one, of overreach. My opponent's entire case is contradictory. They say there are effective checks in the system, yet there's congressional gridlock. They have no warrant under this impact because effects cannot be effective if there is gridlock. Then we show you how the president has sole authority. He has overreached the War Powers Resolution. According to Witherspoon Institute, he determines the targets. He determines their connection to 9/11. He determines the resources used. They bring up one example of Somalia. We are still to this day fighting Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and even in cross-sects, they cannot tell you why that is authorized under the AUMF. This entire debate, my opponents have just been giving the same justification, the same excuse the president uses under the AUMF, and this is inherently wrong. The AUMF gives them the exact wording and gives them inherent war powers according to the Heritage Foundation, and this has led to instability throughout the world. This leads to my second main voting issue of instability. What my opponents claim is they claim that terrorism is spreading. They admit in rebuttal and their summary that there are splinter forces. For every one terrorist organization we may take down in the short term, 5 others come in their place. They haven't refuted our Army War Color Card, which says that for whenever we invaded, there's 134 more terrorist attacks. The foreign policy card, which stated there are 6 times more suicide bombings in Iraq and Afghanistan because of U.S. intervention. Their only claim is decreases ISIL has lost territory. One, we should not have been fighting ISIL in the first place. So we caused the creation of ISIL. They admit in their own case that terrorism is increasing, and this simply just tells you that U.S. intervention under the AUMF is unjustified. Judges. As terrorism is increasing, civilian casualties are increasing at the highest rate, and there's erosion on checks and balances. This is inherently too much power, and that's why you must affirm.
Begin. The first voting issue in today's debate is that the AUMF uniquely allows us to combat terrorism globally. In order for any efficiency and guarantee national security, the president needs to have the flexibility to fight terror globally. Remember that ISIS is losing land and power, and because of that, we're solving for the root cause of terror. My opponents are continually attacking this by saying that all these groups weren't included under the 9/11 AUMF. Recognize that there's flexibility in the AUMF for a reason. It's to allow for these splintering groups that have been created after 9/11. They can see themselves that ISIS was a part of Al-Qaeda when the 9/11 terror attacks occurred. That's why the 9/11 is. That's why the AUMF is so flexible in its basic rhetoric, because it's allowing for these splinter groups to be taken care of under the AUMF. Terror is an evolving threat. That's why we need the AUMF to evolve along with it. Terror is never going to disappear. It's only going to evolve, and that's why we need the AUMF's flexibility to continually combat it. Now, we're weighing on magnitude since the AUMF uniquely saves lives, is liberating millions, and is solving for the root cause of terror. Now, they never respond to the idea that our intervention overseas has taken out these high-level operatives and has resulted in a 22% decrease in the global amount of terror. We're showing you right here in the most recent piece of evidence that terrorism on a global scale is decreasing. Recognize that all of their evidence is from 3 years ago. Thus, we're showing you the most recent evidence that the AUMF intervention is causing this efficacy. And then we're showing you further how this loss in ISIS's land, which has again gone unattacked, is solving for the root cause of terror, meaning that their eventual recruitment of further terror is gone down as well. So in the net, we're showing you most recent evidence as to why the AUMF has decreased terrorism. Now, the second voting issue is the system of checks and balances that keeps the AUMF from being abused. Recognize that 2 of those 3 have gone unattacked and dropped by my opponents, while the second one, talking about the Congress holding the power of the purse, the only attack is that we're back in Somalia fighting Al-Shabaab. Recognize that when the initial intervention was there, we got out with the power of the purse. Now that Al-Shabaab has moved back in, we've used the flexibility of the AUMF to go back in and continue fighting them. My opponents attack this by saying there's this contradiction. Recognize that Congress can be slow at times. That's why we need the president's unilateral action. But overall, with gridlock, they own the potential to repeal it. And for these reasons, Piyush and I strongly urge a ballot negation. Thank you.